guests each week, bringing you the best relationship advice.
Welcome to Oxygen 365. I'm your host, Noel Metter, and this is episode number 32. Today's guest is Dr. Shon Neyland. Dr. Neyland is a veteran of the Air Force, where he served for 29 years. He's a minister, motivational keynote speaker, and licensed professional counselor who has counseled over 4,000 couples and led over 45 marriage retreats. He has been married to his wife, Madeline, for 30 years, and together they have 3 children. Dr. Neyland, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Noel. It's so glad to be with you.
Man, I'll tell you, I think it would be appropriate to start with more of an introduction of your background, because you're kind of unique in terms of folks that we've had on the show. And not only are you an author, but you also serve in a pretty high-ranking role. And maybe just tell us a little bit about that and maybe a little bit of a disclaimer before we get started.
Yes, thank you, Noel. Before we go forward, as you said, a little disclaimer is that all of my views and opinions represented today are mine, in fact, and do not represent that of the Air Force or the Department of Defense. I've been serving in the military, as you said. Actually, I've moved from 29. No, I've had an anniversary. I'm over 30 years as we speak. And so it's exciting to be in the military. And now I don't do normal pastoral things. As you said, I've done counseling over the years. I've counseled many thousands of couples, in fact, in retreats, as you've indicated. Now I do what's called plans and policies and programs. So I write those policies that will affect change throughout the Air Force.
Got it. Well, it's good to have you on the show, and really just for our audience to know that what they're going to gain out of our time is really discovering and applying unconditional love. And this is not an easy topic. It's an important topic. It's not always an easy one when it shows up in the context of marriage. So maybe let's just start there and jump right into this. You know, you talk about in your book, the keys to a lasting relationship is unconditional love, which I agree, but it requires a heart change. And I guess my question is this: how do you know when the heart change has happened in order to love unconditionally in your relationship?
Well, that's a great first question. It is very difficult. I love the way you phrase that, because if we think it's easier and we say, well, just love unconditionally, just forgive everything, and everything will be great in your marriage and you'll be blissfully happy, that is not going to work. It does take work. And the way you get there, the heart change, and I say in the book that it requires a heart change, because if I just simply do acts of service, let's say I show you acts of kindness, I open a door, I greet you in the morning, I kiss you, I provide for you, I do all of these things. Paul illustrates that that is not enough in the Bible. In fact, in 1 Corinthians, he says, if you could speak with all of the words of the great poets, it does not matter if you have not love. If you give all that you can to the poor, it doesn't matter if you have not love. And so that's the direction, Noel, I'm going with in the book. In other words, even when I do great things for my spouse, if my heart is not in it and it hasn't changed, then I'm really not acting in true unconditional love. Okay. But go ahead.
No, I think that's a great, it helps create a definition around this, because I think so often the fairy tale method of, hey, you know, all things will work out together. Couples are going, yeah, that doesn't work in our situation. So that's good. I'm glad that you clarified, but keep going.
Well, I was going to go further with that question, because that first question is so good, is that then how do you know the heart is changed?
Yeah.
You know it's really sincere. It's when you do it, and you don't think about it. It's when you do it and you're not regretting what you're doing. Let me ask you this question. It's rhetorical. Have you ever done anything for someone that you love, but as you're doing it, you're like, I don't know why I got to do this every time, and they're asking me to get the dog, and that's not unconditional love.
I'd have to say yes. I've definitely been down that road too many times, but yes.
Yes. So what we're looking for is the ability to do it. And you say, you know what? I'm going to do it because you asked, and I'm not going to do it begrudgingly. Remember, there's another parable that kind of closely ties to this when Paul talked about giving to God. He says, God loves the cheerful giver. He doesn't want us to give begrudgingly, nor does he want us to love begrudgingly. We must love unconditionally, but it is a heart. So it's a heart matter. And so my book focuses on, and I love all of the books out there, the His Needs, Her Needs, and Five Love Language by Dr. Chapman. I mean, great people. I've met them personally, actually, and I've talked to many of them. I have no qualms with these principles of healthy relationships, and obviously they've done great for the kingdom of God and for marriages. But I believe this unconditional love takes a different twist. In other words, if I do what I do out of doing it because I'm acting in a way you want me to act, but my heart is not in it, eventually it's going to wear out. And so that's what I mean by the heart change. So you do the works, but you do the works out of a heart change. To love as Christ loved, to love 70 times 70, I talk about in my book. And people say, come on, that's impossible. It is in the natural, but God can give us the strength to move towards it, not necessarily perfection, but to get towards it.
Okay. So I got to think that if I'm a listener right now, and I'm sure there's quite a few of them are thinking, that sounds great in a theoretical sense, and maybe even from a faith-based perspective, but man, you're not married to the person I'm married to. And quite honestly, at the end of the day, I'm not so sure I'm willing to give unconditional love because of our past, because of the way that they've hurt me, or the way that they have broken the trust in our relationship. What do you say to that listener right now who's really questioning this and saying, you know, I can understand it in the empirical, but I can't understand it on a practical?
That's a very good question, Noel. I think I would say to that listener, and listener, I would encourage you to stop and think. And if you would simply go to 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter, and you will begin to look at those principles that love is patient, love is kind, and say, Lord, give me the strength to live those kinds of principles. And in my book, I take you through each of those principles, and I open up those principles to make them practical and relevant in your life. And I would say to you, yes, it is hard. And what I'm espousing could sound theoretical to some, but in reality, I have lived it, and I think there are many others who are living it. Let me give you an illustration. That always helps to make it plain. Here's one for you. If I wake up in the morning and I look at my spouse and I say to myself, my spouse is not perfect, and I go, yes, that is true. But then I look in the mirror and I say to myself, you are not perfect. And so when I realize that both of us are imperfect beings who have decided to be together and who have chosen one another for whatever reason, there had to be a reason that we were drawn together. And so if I start my day off realizing that I'm going to make mistakes, she's going to make mistakes, he's going to make mistakes, whatever the relationship is, and say, I recognize that, and now I can move forward in saying I am just going to love in a practical way.
Okay, so I'm going to ask it a little bit differently because I'm going to press in on this because I just know our listeners. I just know them, and I love what you're saying, but when is enough in a marriage? Is there a point where it's just, you know what, flat out, I've dealt with everything I can handle, and I just can't keep going? Is there a point, in your opinion?
Well, in my opinion, there is a point because we're human, and that's the whole beauty of God. God's love is unconditional in a perfect sense. No, he never gives up on you and I, no matter how many times we sin. As I said earlier, 70 times 7, and he says for the same offense, the same day. We can't even do that. 7. I might not forgive you one time, and you're talking about 70 times.
Right.
But and it's just reality, isn't it? But when is enough enough? Okay. here again, I love illustration. So I'll try to make it as plain as I can for the listener, because my mind may be processing it a different way that's not communicating effectively. That's a big principle in marriage, by the way. Communicate effectively. Ensure that you're being heard. Okay, so if I try to go through and I love a person and they don't reciprocate the love, and I think this is where you're going, and I keep reaching out, I keep doing those good things, I'm faithful, I'm trying to do devotionals, I'm praying, I'm taking the kids out, I'm giving home financially, I'm providing, I'm a lover. I want to work on those 5 areas of emotional, social, intellectual, spiritual, and physical. I'm committed to working on every area of my marriage. But yet the other person resists me. And they said, no, I'm not reciprocating that love.
Right.
That, my friend, is where you begin to run up against the wall. People have asked me then, how long is that? Every person is different. It's called biological variability. So you and I know, although we are young and handsome men, I just threw that in there.
Yeah, I can definitely speak for that on your side. But we were commenting about this earlier in the show before we got started. Like, you look like you're 29 and you serve 29, man. I mean, you just your genes hold well.
My genes hold well. It's just a gift of God. A gift of God.
There you
I
go.
get it all the time. But really, and I know I digress. Sorry about that. But it is that kind of wall that you will face. So you keep loving, and you will face those walls. But the key to overcoming those walls, is simply saying, I am not going to quit. I'm not going to give up in the relationship. But if I face that wall, and if you do keep giving that love and that person does not respond, yes, there comes a time where that love may not be returned and you may give up on the marriage.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Well, I love what you're sharing here, because I think so often in our society, we're so fickle on this thing of love. I mean, it's all connected to the feeling. If I'm not feeling it, then I don't have to reciprocate it. And so much of what we see today in terms of disposable marriages really come from an attitude of, it's just, if the feeling's not there, then I don't know if we can stay together, or we're going to see this as a long-term arrangement. What you're talking about is that love is not a feeling. It's based on action. And it might require again and again and again the same action, and it's not even reciprocated. So to that, I think we can all say, yes, that's awesome. It's powerful stuff to be able to share. So let me move us into the next question. You talk about in your book, and I want you to unpack this for us, because I think it's an interesting concept. What does it mean to protect your spouse?
Yes. When I talk about protecting your spouse, is that love does not want to do injury, does not want to do harm to the spouse. So think of your spouse as someone you want to protect. As when the Lord died for us, the Bible says he presents us faultless, and he sacrificed for us, and that's a protection. That's a form of protection. He presents us. And I think that's what we should do for our spouses. We need to treat them as we would want to be treated. And any sane person would want to be treated with care and tenderness. And so when I talk about protecting, you're not trying to harm. So you're not using negative words. You're not tearing down. You're building up. You're not ripping apart. You're not saying, I'm better than you. You're less than me. It's those kinds of principles that revolve around protection. So protection is basically saying that I want to ensure that my spouse is protected and taken care of, that there's safety, there's not harm. So I protect my spouse from those who would, outside of the marriage, who would do harm. But a lot of times the harm comes from within, through verbal, through physical assault, through those kinds of actions. And that's what I mean when I talk about love protects, love cares for the other.
So is a prerequisite to that kind of the hitting the reset button on the relationship in some ways? I mean, I just think that's a great, noble thing to offer, but I'm just, again, coming at it from the angle of, I mean, we've worked with so many couples, and so many of them, as much as they would love to agree to that, in the midst of what they're dealing with. And I guess I'm more talking about the conflicted, devitalized couple than the one who's just wanting to maintain what they have.
Right.
Is the reset button required? And when I mean reset, like this process of walking out forgiveness.
Yes, absolutely. And to be honest, no, we always have to reset. I think every couple probably resets every so often, and it might be more often than we think. It's how do you re-energize that relationship? So forgiveness is a very important part. And one blog I've written recently, I said, without forgiveness, your marriage will end. I mean, that's pretty strong. Mm-hmm. It is true. Without forgiveness, our relationships are doomed. And I used to teach a program called PrEP, Prevention Relation Enhancement Program. And they talk about this concept that I've kind of adopted, and I love it. So I want to give them all credit. But it talks about reconciliation equals forgiveness plus trust. And so in my book, I kind of lay that out, that if you want to reconcile with your spouse, reset, as you call it, I like that term, then there has to be trust in the relationship. Trust, though, is built up over time. If you break the trust through an affair, you can't expect the next day, okay, I apologize, let's just go back to normal. It takes time to rebuild the trust. Yeah. And over time, as you're rebuilding that trust, that means you build trust, through reliability. And reliability means that the spouse can see what you are doing. In other words, you're transparent, you keep your word, you actually carry through or follow through what you said you would do. Yeah. Now, so when you take reliability, that builds my trust. Remember this, trust is how I feel or how I think. It's not really tangible. Reliability, though, is what I see. If I told you I would be home at a certain time, if I told you I wasn't going to go to certain websites, if I told you I wasn't going to call, if I wasn't going to interact, then I need to demonstrate that. So now you add that trust, because now my mindset is changing because I see that you're living out what you said you will live out. Now I can add that to the element of forgiveness, which is simply saying, I release you from your debt. You don't owe me anything. I don't keep a record of it. Forgiveness simply means that I release you from the infraction that was put upon me. Now, so when I add that forgiveness and I put it to trust, I can finally get reconciliation, which means the two coming together and resetting, as you said, and starting afresh. But here's what I tell couples. What good is it to reconcile if you don't change? What good is it for you to come together if you're not going to say, I'm going to learn healthy principles of marriage, and then I'm going to actually apply the healthy principles of marriage. So every relationship, and I want to encourage the listener right now, if I can, every relationship can be saved and every marriage can be improved, but it takes two people who are willing to learn the principles, and then third, to apply the principles. My issue that I have most of the time when I do retreats and couples counseling and we come up with these game plans and set goals is that people don't follow through.
Right.
And that's very difficult.
And could it be, because I got to come back to this forgiveness thing, because you said something that I think maybe has left some questions in the listener's mind. I mean, you say that there is forgiveness is keeping no record of wrong and releasing them of that debt. But I have to think that there's some sitting here going, yeah, but the penalty of what they've done to me, there is a debt that needs to be paid at this point, and I'm not willing to let them off the hook until that's been paid. And so what do you say to them? Because I think that the concept of forgiveness is one that is quite confusing to the general public. You've heard it. I mean, we throw around these statements like, bury
the hatchet.
Well, not bury the hatchet. No, the one that I'm thinking of is forgive and forget. Like that's a truism that in our society we adopt as truth. But if you look and unpack that statement, is very contrary to what true forgiveness is. So I got to stop us here and just kind of rewind a little bit and say, well, what about the couple who's sitting there saying, you know what, they owe a debt and it's big. I mean, what they've done to me, I'm not just going to release them of that.
Well, let me ask you this question. Let me counter that. When the Lord forgives us and we come to him, does he say to us, well, Shon, you know, you have repented of your sin, but before you can actually be saved or born again, you must show me that you must make up for all of your wrongs in your past. Now, there's a converse side to that. I go to prison, I commit a crime, I'm in jail or in the prison, and I say, Lord, forgive me for my crime. The judge doesn't say, because you repented to the Lord and he's forgiven you, there are no consequences. So notice, I've never said there are no consequences with our actions. But what I am trying to encourage the listener is to move from the secular thinking of forgiveness. And for instance, I said, if you bury your hatchet, let's bury the hatchet. I always say, if you say bury your hatchet, I know where that hatchet is at. I can go and get it when I get angry. And I'm going to pull that hatchet out and I'm going to bring up the past so that's not what I'm advocating. I'm advocating. I know this is why it's so difficult, because I'm advocating that we look at the other through the eyes of Christ, that we look at our partner and say, you know, God forgave me. He washed me. He cleansed me and he saved me. And so my job is to look at my spouse and say, I love you unconditionally. I am not going to do a tit for tat, because you know what? No, if I do a tit for tat, did I really forgive you? If I say you have a debt to pay, we'll stay together, but I'm going to treat you with disdain and I'm going to treat you with, and again, don't misunderstand that I can't conceive the pain that some acts and egregiousness that they bring to a person. I'm tracking with that. I'm not downplaying heinous behavior at all. But what I'm saying is that if we're going to move to true forgiveness as God would forgive, in unconditional love, by the way, then it's going to take a spiritual mindset versus the secular mindset. And by that, I mean, you really do have to work through this concept of letting it go, not forgetting. And that's a good correction on your part. And I may have misspoken, because I don't want you to forget it, because you can't. It's impossible for me to tell you, just forget that act that happens. But what I'm asking the listener to do, and what I try to do myself, is say that act that I remember in my mind, because it's real, it's painful, it's there. There are going to be circumstances that's going to remind me of it. I am going to go beyond that and love unconditionally.
Got it. Yeah, this is so powerful.
It is.
You know, and yet, if I think for someone who maybe isn't at that same place in their faith journey as what you're describing, part of this hinges on understanding the reality of forgiveness when we're talking about in the realm of our own personal grievances, right? And reconciling with God, if that is part of their faith journey, that is a key component that you're describing here. And so I think for some, it can get confusing when that's not there, because if there isn't someone paying for that atrocity or that heinous behavior or whatever, it's a natural tendency for us to say they owe that debt and they need to pay it. And what you're saying is it's been paid by someone on a cross, and that is the piece that allows us to walk in a place of forgiveness versus holding out for our spouse to pay retribution. Is that essentially what
that's very well stated, because think about what you just said. If I hold out for my spouse and I said, okay, because then unconditional love is no longer applicable, because in my definition of it, because then I'm doing unto others what they have done to me. I'm making you pay for the crime you've committed against me, the hurt that you've brought in my life. Well, then why are we talking about unconditional love? Right. Because unconditional love, that's what, and by the way, radio listeners, podcast listeners, That is what the normal couple does. That's why 50% of every relationship ends in divorce. 65% of second marriages end in divorce. 75% of third marriages end in divorce. Those who cohabitate
Well,
and live together, it ends in divorce 75% of the time because we don't understand the concept that we're talking about
well, and
today.
I think even more than statistics is really what, at the end of the day, the only person that it hurts really is the person who's walking in unforgiveness. Generally,
Mm-hmm.
the person who's been the offender has already moved on beyond, they're not still dwelling on it. It's the person who feels like, man, they owe me, and they're walking around with unforgiveness. I mean, you just look at it purely from a clinical, medical standpoint, and you can see, unforgiveness has all kinds of issues that follow with it. Not to talk about the emotional
Yes.
part of it too. So it's somewhat of the analogy of, hey, I'm going to get back at you by drinking the rat poison and expecting you to pay for it, when the only person that's hurting is me in return.
Absolutely.
Here's one thing that I this is just recently. I was talking to a couple who long-term marriage, and they quite honestly, they're kind of some people that I look up to, kind of heroes of this whole, marriage journey. And yet they found themselves at a crossroads where I literally for an hour heard basically each of them list all the reasons why they have been the ones to for the last 30 years to pay the price of their spouse, or really, the way they phrased is, I'm the one that's, having to make adjustments for them, and I'm right. I mean, basically, I'm right, they're wrong, and
Right.
and here this thing has played out for so many years, and now they're at the crossroads where they find themselves saying, I don't know if I want to keep doing this. I don't know if I want to keep
Right.
going forward. And I found myself thinking on there that, man, one of you's got to die, not physically, but
Yes.
selfishly, you got to die to your
Yes.
rights. And quite honestly, they both had great arguments for why they were the right one in that scenario.
But isn't that interesting that both of them thought that they were right and both thought they were making a sacrifice
Yep.
for the other?
Exactly.
Wow.
I mean, just to carry that thought out for a second, because we're on this topic, I just thought, if we're going down the faith journey of Christ and what he did, the sooner that he died, the sooner there's a resurrection in terms
Yes.
of the hope that we have. And I think that's true for marriages today, that the sooner we recognize that, man, there's a death that has to be required, and it's not physical, it's the
Yes.
selfishness. The sooner that happens in the relationship, the sooner there can be a reconciliation in the relationship. But it takes one of us to make that decision that I'm gonna choose to die to my, and you might have all the reasons why you're the right person, and
Right.
you can stand on your argument for why this is right. This is good stuff, and I guess I would just ask. This is kind of one of the final thoughts on this is. What about the couple who isn't necessarily experiencing abuse, infidelity, some of these major problems that we were talking about, but just they don't feel happy or compatible? They're kind of in that place where compatibility is not there. We just don't feel happy anymore.
Right.
And, they're kind of contemplating, do we keep going forward or do we divorce? What would you say to them? How can they start to improve their relationship?
Well, if I may, I want to go back to that couple, that example that you gave,
Yeah.
and then I'll come back to the compatibility.
Sure.
That's a very good question. I would encourage the first couple that you mentioned this is perfect for unconditional love, because here's a couple that have walked the journey of marriage. They've sacrificed and both believe their sacrifice. If I were counseling that couple, you know what I would do? No, I'll get them both to acknowledge and see that they're both right. Yes, both of you have sacrificed, and that's what marriage is about. Both of you have sacrificed, both of you have given, and that's what unconditional love is about. Because if I can get both spouses to love unconditionally, you say, look, you're not going to always have it your way. Everything is not going to happen the way you want it. The physical intimacy is not going to be as good as you would like it or it used to be. The social interaction, the intellectual conversation may not be as stimulating. So the point I'm making, though, is simply that couple has the ability to push through if they recognize that both have unconditional love and it's being demonstrated. Now, going to your second point,
Yeah.
Noel, is that if we have a couple who does not have the major factors of infidelity or sexual abuse or
Right.
physical abuse,
Right.
etc., and they're just unhappy. This is the most common that I get, actually, and I love those because they're the easiest ones in my mind. Because what I help that couple do is realize why they came together in the first place. So I take them back, if you will, and I get them to think about what was the first thing that drew them together. And so I want to encourage someone who may be in that very situation you're talking about to simply think about where you were and why you came together. Then, secondly, I would talk to them about what makes them unhappy, what makes them feel unhappy. And then we would simply walk through that process and begin to identify how to counter that through simple principles of healthy living, healthy communication, healthy marriage, marital principles. Then I would then throw in the unconditional love wild card because I think that's the factor that changes things.
Yep.
So now I say we set these goals. We recognize that we got married for a reason, and now we're unhappy, and we've listed some of these things on both sides that make us unhappy and why we're contemplating divorce or separation. Now I throw in the unconditional card, wild card, and I said, okay, let's now attack these things with unconditional love. And so we go through that process. So we will take let's say a couple may be experiencing intimacy problems. Let's say one couple has a physical ailment that prevents intimacy as much as it used to be. And so the couple says, well, I can't live like this for the rest of my life. And then I said, well, what would make you happy? What could be a compromise? And so we begin to work through that. And then I throw in, again, on top of it all, unconditional love. Can you stop and think and say, if you were in that situation, if you had a physical ailment that was preventing you from fulfilling the needs of your spouse, would you want your spouse just to give up on you because of that one factor? Isn't marriage more than that? Yes, it's important in marriage, but it's not the only factor in marriage.
Yeah.
And so I guess in summary, when you're dealing with people who are dealing or facing unhappiness, which is very common, as you said, in marriage, and that's what Hollywood tells you, depart. If you're unhappy, hey, don't fight for your marriage, give up on it. This is where I come in and say, no, learn healthy principles of marriage and how to overcome those areas that I'm most unhappy in, and throw it and put on top of it unconditional love.
Good stuff. Well, I'll tell you, just what you were talking about in closing is you talk about the principles of living this out, and really this book that you've written does a great job of that. So what we're talking about is loving when you don't feel like it, which is, I think, such a great title. When you're framing all this up, it really it comes down to, it's not a feeling, it's an action that we're asking people to walk out and to live out. And so for listeners, if they want to learn more about what you're doing, you have a website. It's is it maximizingyourrelationships.com? Is that the best
sir.
one? Okay.
That's the best one. And you can see all of the things that I'm doing, the blogs, and just trying to make a difference in the lives of people. And I just say this to the listener, is that if you determine yourself today, you might be thinking about, I'm about to divorce. I'm so glad I heard Noel and Oxygen and